Welcome to the inaugural Kaijusaurus Podcast. My name is Steven Sloss. I have been a Kaiju fan for 15 years now, and I run the Tumblr blog Kaijusaurus. And with me is...
I'm Roz Menzies, and I'm essentially absolutely unfamiliar with the entirety of the Kaiju canon, the works, the list. I don't know. You are very familiar, Stephen. You have a very prized DVD shelf.
Allegedly.
It may or may not be entirely organised. You may or may not have a spreadsheet of everything that you have.
Used to. Lost track of it all.
But here we are, recording a podcast.
Yes, well,
basically.
Basically what we want to do here is... Ross approached me with the idea a wee while ago of, with myself as an expert, allegedly, and he as a novice, that we should watch the entire 30-film Godzilla canon and discuss the films per episode. Hopefully that will go ahead. What we're doing right now is basically a test run, a pilot, if you will.
And you must, essentially.
Well, it's not optional, so...
Yeah, exactly. So get ready.
A non-canon episode 0.
Yes.
For the purposes of this pilot episode, however, we have not watched any Godzilla films. We have instead watched the first episode of Toei's 1978 Japanese Spider-Man series, popularly known as Japanese Spider-Man or Supaidaman. I apologise in advance for any pronunciation errors.
I don't.
Ross is unrepentant in all walks of life.
Spider-Man.
Right, so Toei's Spider-Man series. This was new for you, Ross.
It absolutely was. I was not familiar with Toei's Spider-Man series. And you have informed me that this is an officially licensed Marvel... not adaptation, but a Marvel sort of franchise, essentially.
Absolutely, yeah.
How long did it run for?
It ran for 41 episodes, I believe. 41 episodes plus a theatrical episode.
Theatrical episode?
Yeah.
When are we watching that? When is that happening?
Let's do it right now.
Yes. But no, and this was released, what,
1978.
1978. Yeah. And so, basically, my first question was, it was really just, or not even a question, but I just wanted to really... Who was responsible for this? Who in Marvel said, right, okay guys, here's an idea. Why don't we adapt Spider-Man for a Japanese audience and just let them have absolute creative control? Just let's radically change the character, backstory, dynamics, arsenal. They really do run Spider-Man through a lot of different changes here. A lot of them I prefer, to be honest.
Me too. I'm so glad you asked.
Yes.
From what I've read, this series was the product of a 3-year licensing deal between the Japanese studio Toei, who are known for Super Sentai series. Super Sentai is a series that would go on to be adapted to become Power Rangers.
Right.
A 3-year licensing deal between Marvel and Toei, which the details of this are sketchy and quite hard to find, but basically... that would allow both parties free use of each other's characters.
Right, okay.
For 3 years.
What did Marvel get out of this? What were they getting?
Not that much, apparently. Because, again, from what I could find, Toei also produced a series called Battle Fever J, or J, as part of this licensing deal, which was originally conceived as a series about a Japanese equivalent of Captain America called Captain Japan. Okay. That never happened, unfortunately. And it was just reworked into a sort of standard Tokusatsu hero show. Tokusatsu...
Tell me more. Yeah,
I just dropped that term and I realised you wouldn't know it. Tokusatsu is a Japanese term that basically means special effects. Mm-hmm. So a Tokusatsu film... would be just a film that deals heavily with special effects. Okay. And when we use the term tokusatsu, it most commonly refers to practical effects, miniatures, men in suits, that sort of thing.
Right, because the first thing I'll say, obviously, is that the thing that stood out the most, and that, spoilers, by the way, the Spider-Man here has access to an arsenal of flying robots. And as someone that's not entirely familiar what you said about this company being involved later with Power Rangers made perfect sense, because obviously those robots, the way they were designed, the way they looked, it was the most, as someone that's barely familiar with a lot of these things, Power Rangers was the most obvious thing that I thought.
Yeah, well, you hear that a lot. Like, people who have little to no experience in this genre, that's their point of entry, that's their point of identification and comparison. It's always Power Rangers, so it's... Yeah, I mean, with this, you're not far off at all.
Exactly. But, so it's a strange one. I was pretty thrilled. It certainly is. Yeah. I think this is the pilot episode, and it definitely at least sticks to the sort of genre rules by being a beginnings episode, an awakening, an origin story. Yeah. About Japanese Spider-Man. Now, we learn a little bit about him, his life. He's not Peter Parker.
No, he's Takuya Yamashiro, a hotshot motorcycle.
Yeah, so
artist.
Yeah, we first meet Takuya, I think, in like a muddy field, biking about.
Yeah, just biking about.
He's with his sister, if I'm right, or a friend.
He's with his little brother and a friend who is a woman.
Yes.
Who is a photographer for a newspaper. We'll later meet his sister.
Yes. I'm all there. But so Takuya likes hanging about, playing on his dirt bike. I imagine doing some wheelies, scraping about in the dirt.
He's your typical youth.
He's he's just like me. I empathise. I understand. That's what I like to do. And simultaneously to this, we sort of have some cuts to some other characters who I have ascertained to be Professor Monster. So we cut to Professor Monster. Where is he? I couldn't quite figure that out.
In the first episode, I mean, now that you're saying it, we don't really find out. I mean,
he's somewhere ominous. This is clearly our villain, our antagonist, Professor Monster. He's a strange man. He's got a sort of robotic sort of eye lens thing going on.
He's got half a robot face.
He's not immortal maybe, but he's certainly been alive for a long time. He mentions in his monologue to his sort of like evil side mistress,
the Amazoness,
that he has been alive for 400 years. He's been doing this evil game for a very long time, and as far as I know, he's come to Earth. He's not from Earth.
Yes,
he's an evil alien.
Aye.
So really, we see a lot of that, we dabble with that, and then we really go back to Takuya, who lives with his father, who I believe is a scientist.
Yes, Dr. Hiroshi Yamashiro.
And his official title, I believe, is an astroarchaeologist.
An astroarchaeologist. I'm so glad you picked up on that, because that's just... I mean, what a field that must be.
It really must be. But so... Unfortunately, tragedy strikes when an asteroid seems to crash to Earth, and Takuya and his family decide they're going to go on a little hike. A family hike, because this is a family of not a family of scientists, but the family spearheader, the doctor. He's a scientist. I imagine the family gets up to all things, all sorts of sciencey things. Mary Japes, and I mean, and then that's obviously the parallel between Peter Parker and Takuya, the sort of background in science.
Yeah.
So, in a way, like, well, Peter Parker's family or parents are implied to be scientists, but you never really meet them.
Yeah.
This is really just Peter Parker if his parents didn't die.
Well, I would like to draw another comparison with Peter Parker and his origin story in relation to Takuya's, because, spoilers again ahead, obviously, as this hike goes on, events take not so great turn.
A tragic turn,
Stephen. A less than preferred
I did have to pause to weep.
Yeah. And Takuya's father is murdered.
Brutally slain against the rocks.
Slain against the rocks by one of Professor Monster's machine bems.
Yes.
Which is an umbrella term for basically an army of disposable sentient monsters Professor Army has. And that's sort of where the series gets its kaiju connections from.
Right.
Anyway,
yeah.
The comparison that I want to draw is that Peter Parker and Takuya both lose a father figure in their origin.
Yes.
It's difficult to tell if this was deliberate on Toei's part, but this is Uncle Ben. This is the Uncle Ben story.
Oh, absolutely. That does make perfect sense, and like you said, there's a lot of parallels throughout this show. You highlighted specifically the scene in this episode we just watched where Spider-Man learns about his powers. He's in his room. It's very similar to that scene from Spider-Man 3. No,
just Spider-Man.
The original Spider-Man.
The first Sam
Raimi film.
Yeah.
Which is very similar. Spider-Man being in his room, bucking about with his webs, doing little backflips.
Yeah, and then later, Norman Osborn comes in. It's been years since I watched it, but I think Norman Osborn and Aunt May and James Franco all come into his room to find him, and he's not there, and he's
on the ceiling.
He's just on the ceiling, and that happens in this episode as well.
Yeah, Takuya's family discover him, or discover the lack of him. But anyway... Takuya's family, his father is murdered on a hike. And that really starts this Spider-Man, which has sort of been a lot more towards revenge and vengeance. That I want to talk about that in a little bit. But first of all, carrying on, his father is killed. Takuya is heartbroken, but he essentially...
He's not got time to be heartbroken.
He does not have time to be heartbroken, because he's been receiving a strange... sense of purpose, a strange message in his head urging him to sort of... it doesn't really urge him to do anything. It just sort of keeps saying, come on, or something to that ilk.
Brother.
A voice that refers to him...
Come on, man.
A voice speaking to him is summoning him, and eventually he follows that voice and figures out, or discovers, rather, an old man living in a cave. And this, if I recall correctly, is Garia.
Garia.
Now, who is Garia?
Well, to answer that, I'm going to delve a bit more into the history of the show itself.
Right, carry on.
Because as part of their plan, Toei, as part of the licensing agreement, Toei originally intended to use Spider-Man as a supporting character.
Okay.
In a show about a time-warped version of the legendary Japanese hero Yamato Takeru.
Right.
Who was a prince from the Yamato dynasty and has gone on to become a hugely legendary folk figure in Japan, and has a lot of connections with the birth of Japan story. The series would have featured Yamato Takeru being transported from early Japan in present day 1970s, and I guess he meets Spider-Man.
Well, there you go. They were making the Japanese Avengers. There you go. Obviously. Of course they were. They're always trying to do that. As many characters as they can get thrown together. It's the Marvel way. And it's actually kind of comforting to know they were still trying to do it in the 70s. Just throw as much shit together, see what happens.
But yeah, so the Yamato Takeru character would be reworked into Garia.
Right, that made sense. And because Garia is very much your old wise man who essentially bestows Takuya his powers, because Takuya doesn't really get bit by a spider.
No.
He really just gets given a set of descriptions of this alien planet, because Garia is from the planet Spider.
He is.
He's a wise old man from the planet Spider. And not because he's from the planet Spider, but just from the planet Spider, he's able to have brought a device with him that gives him spider powers. Because Spider-Man does not get bitten by a spider. He gets given the spider bracelet. Which I believe, according to the dialogue, activates the spider protector that makes him Spider-Man. I believe, at least in the description, it seemed to be a 3-step process. It actually seemed to be far more complicated than just being a Spider-Man. Because it's very similar, obviously, to the web canister thing, because there's the divide between the Spider-Man that is bitten by a radioactive spider and just can shoot webs out of his wrists, and the sort of more classic Spider-Man is someone that has the powers of a spider, but he uses his own technology, the spider canisters, to shoot web, to sort of exacerbate his powers.
Okay.
There's a sort of mix of that, in that really that little bracelet is all he has. It puts a magic kind of black splodge on him and makes him Spider-Man in what is a very strange, semi-ridiculous scene that's very similar to the scene in Spider-Man 1. Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, where Peter Parker again learns to use his powers. There's a lot of weird hopping, some slight flipping. Again, Spider-Man's Spidey senses here are like very oddly specific, and I like the way that they're sort of shown on screen, because the sky sort of just fills up with like a sort of neon glowing web that just sort of spans out. It feels like very much like a radar.
Yeah, it looks like a signal.
Yeah, like a signal going out into the sky, and our Spider-Man is able to exactly pinpoint the locations of things. He stands at a building and goes, right, that's 50 kilometers east, and then off he goes. So that's great. But yeah, no, I wanted to just exactly explain that. So here, what makes Spider-Man Spider-Man isn't the radioactive Spider-Man bite, it's the chemical spider extract, which I assume comes from the planet Spider. I assume they have lots of it, but I assume it's harder to come by here on Earth. So, if I'm right in saying, so Garia explains to Spider-Man the situation that Dr. Monster has trapped him here.
Professor
Monster, excuse me. Professor Monster.
Worked for years
to earn that
title. Don't call him Doctor.
I won't belittle him again.
He's not Doctor Doom, although he kind of...
He may as well be.
Is. Yeah.
So Garia was banished to Earth because of his beef with Professor Monster, if I'm correct. And he describes... Incorrect, sorry.
Professor Monster destroyed Planet Spider.
Right.
And... Oh, you've not watched episode 2
I've not watched episode 2. Precious backstory's been
the
denied
amount
to me.
of precious backstory given in the second episode, it's quite spectacular. But Professor Monster invaded and destroyed Planet Spider. Garia arrived too late to do anything about it, and chased Professor Monster to Earth. And they both arrived in feudal Japan, 400 years ago. And there's a really cool scene where Garia and Professor Monster fight among these hordes of charging ancient Japanese soldiers.
Did they used to be friends?
Yeah. They did not.
They did not. Constant enemies. Well, that's better. That's simpler. So Garia explains to Takuya that it's Professor Monster that's responsible for the death of his father.
Yes, indeed.
It's Professor Monster that's responsible for the death of Garia's whole planet. And so, right off the bat, Garia just demands that Takuya seek revenge, gives him spider powers, and dies on the spot.
And sends him on his way. Dies on the spot, becomes a spider, and then gets really bossy.
Yeah, just a really silly, bossy little spider sitting on his shoulder, barking orders. So really, Takuya does get his Spider-Man powers and his thirst for revenge in a really, really like record-breaking speed.
He's to be fair, he is carrying revenge for 2.
Exactly. He is filled to the brim with revenge. He's absolutely raging.
To be fair, Garia is a little bit manipulative in how he says to him to go and get his revenge. He says, seek revenge for my planet and for your father.
But mainly the planet.
Mainly my planet, yeah.
I just thought I would run through some of the more exciting Spider-Man powers that I felt our new Spider-Man here had at his disposal.
Before you do that, I'm just going to say that, as you would probably guess, this series has been criticised a lot.
Really?
How dare you? This series has been criticised a lot for bearing little to no resemblance to the Marvel version of Spider-Man. Any sort of incarnation. Specifically the comic book character which it's adapted
from. I absolutely see that argument.
Yeah.
I think this is a much better idea. I actually do appreciate this.
In all seriousness, I think the origin story is very interesting. And they do keep much of the core elements of Spider-Man. They just completely rework everything around him. But the series does have its critics, and there's a lot of them as far as I understand. But someone who is a fan is one Stan Lee.
Oh, really? Explain.
Who is on camera, I shit you not, and who is on camera praising the series for its special effects and its stunt work. And something specifically he said he liked is the very spider-like movements of Spider-Man himself.
Yeah, honestly, that is the best part. And it's strange because this Spider-Man is probably... The sort of dynamics of the Spider-Man character and the lore and mythos around him is partly... It feels very... doesn't actually feel that spider-themed, to be honest.
Yeah.
Or more just in the fact that there isn't a radioactive spider involved. He's just given... Planet Spider doesn't seem to have... Well,
you've not gone there yet.
Well, my reasoning is that Garia complains about his time on Earth because it's filled with spiders, leading me to think that Garia isn't, for some reason, actually very used to being with spiders.
Despite coming from Planet Spider.
Despite coming from Planet Spider, which to me is relevant by name alone.
Yeah.
There you go. That's my theory. There's no spiders on Planet Spider.
On some level, Garia is lying.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And again, manipulative. But no, that does actually make a lot of sense. And of course, Stan Lee is going to love it because it has that energy to it. It has that. Because the whole monster thing is so fascinating. Like the costumes and the physical effects and the practical effects always just sort of mixed together to create like something like that.
Because I'm really
fun to watch.
What impresses me about the series, and well, this episode specifically, since that's what we're discussing, is that I really like the building climbing effects.
Yeah,
they look really good, and it's easy to get into this humdrum discussion of this was before the days of CGI when everything was practical, but this. I really like the stunt work. I mean, there's some...
Yeah, it looks great. Like, it really did. And I agree with you on the building climbing looking really cool.
Yeah.
And that actually just reminds me of essentially on Spider-Man's first run of his powers, where he's trying to make it to where he believes Professor Monster will be. Okay. And he ascertains exactly that where he needs to go is 50 kilometers east. He spends a lot of that time climbing up buildings and down buildings.
And climbing back down them,
Very slowly. Or like a very a sort of normal pace. Just taking his time. Where he probably could have walked.
Going to get a pint of milk.
Exactly. Or driven in the Spider-Mobile, which is another thing that he has. Because I think now it's time to talk about Spider-Man's arsenal of robots and vehicles.
Would absolutely love to discuss that.
Yes.
So, Spider-Man, as part of the power bestowed upon him by the ever-manipulative Garia, can summon a spaceship called Marveler, named in honour of DC Comics.
Exactly. Thank you, Dark Horse Comics.
And Marveler can then, when piloted, transform into a giant robot called Leopardon or Leopardon, depending on how you live your life.
Not a spider.
No, and funnily enough, not a spider-related
a leopard.
Robot. Yeah, a leopard-themed robot, which...
A flying leopard from the planet Spider.
There's a lot of inconsistencies running around about Planet Spider and Garia's story, and I just want to go on record as saying I'm on Garia's side. I stand with Garia.
I have to stand with Takuya here. No, but I wouldn't even call it an inconsistency. I would just say it's a subtle way of telling us from the showrunners that we shouldn't be making assumptions about Planet Spider based on the name Spider-Man. For all we know, it could be a mistranslation from the alien language.
Maybe on Planet Spider, the word spider doesn't mean the same.
Exactly. I think what the show is trying to say is that Earth's language really just can't match up to the sort of languages that surely must exist in outer space. But no,
Leopardon. Apparently, Marvel initially opposed the inclusion of a giant robot.
I wonder why.
I know. I mean, why would they oppose it? It fits so organically.
It really does.
Yeah. So apparently, Marvel opposed the inclusion of Leopardon. But Toei managed to wear them down, saying that it's probably going to be a necessary thing to hook young kids into the show. Mm-hmm. Not like Spider-Man and his popularity wouldn't be enough to hook kids. But having said that, apparently, and I think a lot of the show's outlandishness and a lot of its changes to the Spider-Man character and the mythos surrounding it comes from concerns that were expressed about the marketability of Spider-Man as a character in Japan.
Yeah.
And in response to that, the producer, Yoshiniro Watanabe, gave permission for any necessary creative liberties to be taken and applied.
Fantastic.
So,
and that's where we are today.
I mean, I suppose it's admirable in a way that, Toei, they got the name Spider-Man, they got the costume of Spider-Man, and ran with it.
It's bold because that honestly just would never happen now.
You're right.
We are just past the point with sort of like intellectual property and specifically the way our like superheroes are run that just cannot happen. I mean, like, think about the fact that Spider-Man, or at least at time of recording, there's still like controversy surrounding the fact whether or not Spider-Man will like appear at any point in any of the like crossover Marvel films because it's copyright or because he's owned by Sony or his film rights are owned by Sony, which means just. Yeah, like again, imagine the Marvel of today giving free reign to the Spider-Man character.
It's unheard of,
because, that absolutely would not happen. And this is a time, actually, this is worth mentioning. There's in the Sony leaks, an email came out from sort of executive producers around whatever Sony's new Spider-Man film. And one of the producers specifically emailed a checklist of the sort of standout official qualities that Spider-Man / Peter Parker must have. He must match these criteria. He must be these things. And I can't, it was such a strange list. It actually included things like did not have underage sex, did not take drugs or consume alcohol before the age of 18. Well, drugs never. Alcohol before the age of 18. And then it started to get weirdly specific. As far as I remember, the instructions demanded that any adaptation of Spider-Man portray Peter Parker as straight unless Marvel has done otherwise first. And that was a little asterisk. They were trying to just save themselves with that demand. Didn't quite work. But yeah, no, the Marvel of 1978 was making some bold, interesting, creative choices.
They were a different Marvel than we know now.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and I like that. I like taking the idea of another, because you see this so many times when they reboot a superhero or give them a new identity. You have it with the Miles Morales thing with Amazing Spider-Man. What you have is you're taking the idea of a superhero and you're just changing little bits and pieces. You're making it mean something else. You're making them fight for something else. Which I think is great. So I actually really enjoy the 1978 Japanese Spider-Man.
Yeah, see, I'm glad you brought up the whole Marvel of today thing because, and I'm completely serious when I say this, I've brought this up on the blog and stuff, and I did a stream of this series and I brought that up during that as well. I really want this Spider-Man to come into the MCU.
Yes. I wonder if there's a loophole where they can't get Sony's Spider-Man, but they can get the Toei Spider-Man.
Because this, and I'm, again, completely serious when I say this, this Spider-Man and its backstory, its origin, the whole kind of interstellar aspect of it, it would work with the direction Marvel's taken. Because with things like Guardians of the Galaxy and the Guardians of the Galaxy 2 and the two Infinity War Avengers films that are coming out, they're getting more and more cosmic. And, my God, anything but Peter Parker again.
I know. Oh, we don't need him again. So really what you're saying is that Spider-Man just needs to join everyone else in space. He just needs to catch up.
I would love that. And, I mean, no doubt, in an ideal world, if Supaidaman did enter the MCU, no doubt it would be some shit like, Tony Stark built a giant robot called Leopardon and he's letting this young man pilot it.
Excellent.
And I don't want that. I literally want that entire origin story.
Go big or go home. Really.
Cast Ken Watanabe as Garia.
Yeah, and go from there, really.
Go from there.
Just jump from there.
Because God knows it would be more interesting than Asha, whatever his name is, Butterfield playing Spider-Man. I'm sure it's him they've cast.
I can't remember. We could
Martin Scorsese's Hugo.
Right.
He's also Ender's Game.
He's Ender from the game.
He is TV's Ender's Game.
But he is books Ender's Game. Well, really, another thing that I felt very strongly indeed was how so much of this episode, and I assume this show in general, really is bigging up this idea of a very vengeful Spider-Man, a very angry Spider-Man, and the sort of ending credits of the show really, really, really hammer that home.
It's a very somber ending theme, isn't it?
I've taken some lyrics. I've done some light close reading. I mean, Spider-Man refers to himself here as the footsteps of hell. His footsteps are indeed the footsteps of hell, because he's out for vengeance and he's going to bring hell upon his enemies, Professor. He refers to his callous fate, which seems very grim. I don't know how Takuya feels about being Spider-Man, but it seems to be something that he feels inextricably bound to.
He does not seem thrilled.
An inescapable sort of horror. He basically describes his quest as a journey on foot through deserted lands. And this is Takuya, who, aside obviously from the death of his father, has, I believe, a sister and a younger brother and friends.
Yeah,
he has a family keeping him together.
He seems to have a really big racing career just on the brink.
Yeah, exactly. And he refers... I couldn't actually figure this out. He refers to someone as his eternal friend, and I couldn't quite figure out whether it was going to be his dad, and then that brings up a whole very religious aspect of it. Or if he's talking about Garia, which brings up a sort of cute, lovable... a boy and a spider kind of feel. So maybe it's not so bad after all.
Yeah, so I just want to talk more about the deal made between Marvel and Toei and what both parties got from it. I mentioned earlier that Toei were planning a Captain Japan, but it turned into a series called Battle Fever J. It's a shame because from what I could find out, it looks to me like both parties just did not make the most of this deal, and that's a really lucrative deal. That's unreal, actually.
Yeah. Again, as we've established, this does not happen anymore.
Exactly.
Things like this do not happen.
As far as I could find out, on Toei's end, it was Supaidaman, the TV series, Battle Fever J, and an animated TV movie based on the Marvel comic book Tomb of Dracula.
Okay.
And on Marvel's end, they used Toei characters from the series Wakusei Robo Dangard Ace and Shodenji Robo Combattler V in their comic book adaptation of the Shogun Warriors toy line. It's not a lot. Neither really made the full potential of this deal.
No, they really didn't.
Spider-Man.
I did mention earlier that I'd like to see this character come into the MCU. This incarnation of Spider-Man. And you know what? It doesn't seem that outlandish now, because have you heard of the comic event that happened last year called Spider-Verse?
No.
It happened late last year or early this year. I'm not up on comics. Spider-Verse was a big event comic that saw dozens, hundreds, I don't know, of different incarnations of the hero known as Spider-Man come together to fight a great villain. I mean, you had Peter Parker, Miles Morales, you had a Western Spider-Man, you had a steampunk Spider-Man, you had Spider-Man, which is literally if Aunt May was bitten by the spider.
Right.
Right.
And
Okay.
And then you could have just put Takuya right there. You could have just slotted him in there.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because I don't know the scene in context, but as far as I could understand, there's a scene where all hope is looking lost, but suddenly this huge portal erupts in the sky, and through it charges Leopardon.
Right.
And
excellent.
The villain says something like, "Oh, what manner of creature are you?" And the next panel is Takuya as Spider-Man inside the cockpit of Marveler, saying that lovely entrance line from the first episode, "I am the emissary from hell."
That's excellent. I am actually so glad to hear that.
Yeah.
That Takuya's been given his dues.
Yeah. Spider-Man is now in the main Marvel canon, and the line is, "I am the emissary from hell, and I will fight this great evil for the fate of all spiders."
Excellent.
And that's just great.
That really does click it. That's perfect. I'm glad to know. I really am.
Any closing remarks, Ross? I mean, this series, while I've said to you that it's had a lot of its critics, this series is fondly looked back on by fans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I absolutely see why. It really is fun. Like, it's ridiculous. And it's something that just has all those perfect elements that make these things great. Like, it is on production level and on its special effects and on practical effects as well. All those things are always just so fascinating to watch, especially from something from like 1978 or at any point really.
Yeah.
And the similarities and differences between Supaidaman and the classic Marvel Spider-Man really just make this great to watch. I really just enjoy it. Anytime that we take a radical shift away from what Spider-Man's up to,
it's genuinely it's a really interesting take on the character.
And I want more of these.
This is coming from two people who, are not Marvel nuts or aficionados.
Yeah, I can take or leave the Marvel films, and I can honestly take or leave the more recent Spider-Man films.
More
leave.
Yeah.
Let's say, but
they're getting swept under the rug by Marvel.
Yeah,
now,
exactly. But it doesn't
Andrew
really
Garfield's
matter
gone
because they're making a new set of new Spider-Man films.
Please let it be Supaidaman.
Exactly.
They could just title it Spider-Man: The Emissary from Hell.
Exactly, and he is an emissary from hell. A dark. So what we have here really is a dark Spider-Man, a very cosmic Spider-Man, filled with great vengeance and from a faraway planet. Well, not from a faraway planet, but carrying the tools and weapons and knowledge of a faraway world. This Spider-Man really is just the Spider-Man for all universes. I feel like if there was a Spider-Man to save the day in a sort of multiverse situation, it is Supaidaman.
That is an excellent note to leave the show on.
And let's leave it on that.
Thank you very much if you're listening to this. We hope you enjoyed it. And we very much hope to do many more of these. Again, as we said earlier, viewing and reviewing all of the 30 Godzilla films. So, thank you very much.
And thank you very much as well. Cheerio.
Spider-Man. Spider-Man.